Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 Election Science Reform and Administration Virtual Conference, second day. Thank our presenters and discussant. We have two papers today. The third paper has not appeared. Trey Hood and Audrey Haynes. Trey will present this paper with Audrey Haynes on mail-it-in, an analysis of the peach state's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Mara Suttman-Lea will present her paper with Enrijeta, Shino, and Dan Smith on rejection or discrimination vote by mail in the 2018 Georgia general elections. Two really good papers on vote by mail in Georgia, so very current and timely on important matters. We thank our audience for joining us. As an audience member, you can participate in a couple of ways. As those of you who were with us for the panels yesterday will do the same thing. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to open a dialog box that allows you to submit questions to the presenters. That's probably the best way to ask your questions through Zoom, since it's easier for us to see and to manage. And if you would, please identify which presenter you're addressing your question to. You can also, there is a chat function at the bottom. You can use that too to address an individual or the entire audience, but that's a little harder for the managers to see what's going on there. All of the audience members' videos and microphones are disabled. We'll have the moderator or discussant ask your questions to the presenters. So please use the Q&A function if you have questions. We'll start in the order of the program. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and turn it over to Trey so he can present his paper with Audrey Haynes, Mail It In. Take it away, Trey.
Okay, is that up on the screen?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. This was a paper that Audrey and I put together fairly rapidly because the primary in Georgia was just held earlier in June on the 9th. And we were supposed to be studying the new ballot marking system. That was supposed to be the big news in Georgia, completely new voting system that was implemented statewide, and it was implemented. It took till June 9th to be implemented, and we can talk about issues with or surrounding that if we want to, but initially Georgia was going to have its presidential preference primary on March 24th. It ended up being delayed, and then the statewide general primary was going to be on May 19th. It ended up being delayed too. So they were both held together on June 9th. So that's when things happened. Now before that date, I guess the other big news is that the Secretary of State's office sent out absentee by mail ballot applications to all 6.9 million active registrants in the state. So everybody that was an active registrant got a little flyer. I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. There were about 1.61 million requests, and to date, or approximately to date, there have been about 1.15 million absentee by mail ballots counted. Now, I do want to say that a lot of the numbers we're using in this report are preliminary. They haven't certified the final count, and so we'll have to do some updating at another point in time. I don't really view for a lot of these patterns to change, but they may change. The numbers may change a little bit. And this was the mailer that everyone in the state got. That's what it looked like. So the state, I forgot the exact amount of money. Maybe Audrey can tell us later. But the state spent quite a bit of money both mailing this out and hiring a private firm to help produce this. But that's what the application looked like if you receive one in the mail. So I'm going to be making some comparisons to the 2016 and 2018 statewide primaries. So if it says 2016 or 2018, these are primary numbers, not general election numbers. So ABM votes is a percentage of total turnout. Again, Georgia primarily has been an in-person voting state, either early, we do have early voting, or at the precinct on election day. You can see only about 3.5% and 2.4% of the ballots cast in the previous two statewide general primaries were ABM votes, compared to just over half, 52.7%. In 2020. So that was quite a jump, and that was quite a shift in terms of how people were participating. And then the overall primary turnout numbers out of registrants on the rolls. Again, primary elections don't always attract that many people, 16%, 18% in 2018. It does jump up to just about 30% in 2020. You know, so we can talk about the fact that everyone getting an ABM ballot application may have helped spur some of this additional turnout. And of course, turnout's related to a lot of factors, as we know. But that's how things shook out, at least in terms of the primary this year, on the basis of turnout. We have some preliminary data again on who voted. Now the numbers from 2016 and 2018 are pretty firm. Again, they may shift a little bit in 2020 by, you know, a few increments. But this is the vote by mail population in terms of age. And you can see the two prior primaries, 73% exactly in both of those were voters 65 and older, and that slipped down to less than half, 47%. And there were increases, especially in the 45 to 64 age, the 64 years of age category, up to 34%. So there was definitely a shift in who was using ABM in Georgia, as well as a shift in terms of the number of people overall using it. Race, not that big of a shift. Again, overwhelmingly the vote by mail electorate in 2020 is still white, as compared to about, you know, this is about the registrant breakdown currently. So there's not a lot of difference here, and there's not a lot of shifting that went on in terms of race. And there's some shifting that went on in terms of, again, the absentee by mail electorate's overwhelmingly female, and continues to be more than a majority, 57% female. So there was an uptick in the number of males using vote by mail. But again, it's still overwhelmingly female. Now, in terms of party, now again, Georgia's an open primary state. So here we're looking at the ballot that the voters selected when they went to vote in the primary or requested a ballot. You know, did they request to vote in the Republican primary, the Democratic primary? Or you can also get a nonpartisan ballot. There's some nonpartisan races, judgeships that are usually on the ballot. And so it's hard to tell if this is just a continuing pattern. You know, there was a slight majority in 2018 of more Republican ballots than Democratic ballots. That's now slipped down to less than a majority. And on the other hand, there's a little bit of an uptick in the number of Democrats, again, voting in the primary, now at 52% in 2020. And the number of nonpartisan ballots, you know, stays almost the same. What was the past behavior of 2020 primary voters? So if we took those primary voters in 2020 and look what they did in 2016 or 2018, again, not all of these people voted, which again sort of points to the possibility that both maybe the coronavirus outbreak plus the Secretary of State sending out this mailer increased the electorate. But previously, only 33 and 41% of this group had voted in these previous primaries. Most people, about half, did not vote. Some people were not eligible because in 2016 or 2018 they weren't registered. So that's what that column means. But this was a new group to a large extent of primary voters in 2020. Of those voters that did vote in the 2020 primary, what was the previous, of those voters that had previously participated in 2016 or 2018, what was their voting method previously? Well, again, it was either early or at the precinct on election day, so it was overwhelmingly certainly in person. Only 5 and 4% of those voting previously in those primaries were voting absentee by mail. So even among sort of habitual primary voters, there's a major shift in voting method here that occurred in 2020. Now looking a little bit more at the potential effects of COVID-19 and ABM voting in Georgia, we have some county level models. I'm not going to show you the models, but they're in the paper. But these are county level models. Georgia has 159 counties. The mean number of ABM votes cast out of total votes at the county level was 47%, a fairly large range from 16 to 66%. So the dependent variable in these OLS models is just ABM as a percentage of total votes cast. And we're looking at a couple of different potential effects from the coronavirus outbreak. At the county level, again, the number of cumulative cases per 1,000, again, that was up through June 9th. So the cumulative case count up through that date on June 9th. We don't find any statistical relationship, interestingly, between the cumulative case count and the number of ABM ballots that were cast at the county level. We also looked at ABM usage by COVID deaths per 1,000. And there's a slightly, you can see the least squares line here plotted. And again, these circles are counties. The size of the circles related to the size of the number of ABM votes cast. It's slightly positive. When we run it in a multivariate environment, it is a statistically significant relationship, although it's not that powerful in terms of strength. So there you can see sort of the mean numbers, and the range goes from actually 0 to 3.4. Again, these are deaths per 1,000 at the county level. It is statistically significant, and this effect is related to the number of ABM ballots cast as a percentage. The effect's modest. If you were a county that had the mean number of COVID-19 deaths, that would have contributed about about 1.1% additional ABM votes over the average. If you go all the way up to 2 standard deviations above the mean, that would contribute another 5%, or 5% total, excuse me, to the percentage of ABM votes cast at the county level. So there's some explanation here. There's some linkage to reality, but it certainly doesn't explain the mass number of vote by mail ballots that were cast in Georgia in 2020. So just some initial conclusions. Again, going back to, we did implement a new voting system. There were some problems, mostly not with the system so much, but with long lines, especially being reported in Atlanta area counties like Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett to a certain degree, Cobb. So that's what was going on election day for people that did show up to vote in person. I guess you could say to a large extent the efforts on the Secretary of State's part to induce a shift to voters voting or using ABM balloting was largely successful to a large degree, because of the huge surge in ABM balloting, again, which was really unprecedented in a Georgia election, which is, 95% typically in person, either early on election day. There's some evidence, some statistical evidence we found that voters were responding to the actual effects of the pandemic, in terms of deaths per 1,000 in their county. But that only explains part of the surge. Perhaps, and again, this is much harder to get at empirically, if not maybe impossible. I was conducting some public opinion polls for our school during the coronavirus epidemic, which I guess is still going on. But at the end of April, in one of our surveys of Georgia registrants, statewide surveys, 52% reported that they were very or extremely worried about contracting COVID-19. So you know, whether it was the actual circumstance of the pandemic, where they were living, or their perceptions that probably also fed into the surge in ABM balloting that we saw. So that's also part of the explanation. And so that's about as far as we got, again, in the time that we had to sort of put this together. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our discussant and other audience members about thoughts concerning this project. And I'd like to thank the University of Florida for continuing to host this conference, even virtually. So thank you. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
And might I just add really quickly, in reference to the point Trey made earlier about cost. The cost was about 10 to 13 million, and that included sending out and creating and also issuing the ballots for the absentee request forms. And to point out one other thing that the Secretary of State's office did that may have increased participation is inclusion of ballot boxes in various locations that people could return their absentee ballots, because one of the reasons we do see in the literature for people not returning them is their concern that their votes won't be counted, concern that the ballot won't make it through the post office. So that's one additional thing that would have encouraged absentee voting, because they didn't have to mail it in. They could have actually physically delivered it to a ballot box somewhere close to them. So thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Trey, and thanks, Audrey. So our next paper, Mara Suttman-Lea will present her paper with Enrijeta, Shino, and Dan Smith. And I think I saw that Dan joined us for a while. So welcome, Dan. Take it away, Mara.
All right. See if this works. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Did for a minute, and now it's black.
Let's see. This worked before. Try one more time.
Okay, we got the cover page.
All right, let's just see. When I went full screen, I think that's when it is it there?
It's black.
Okay.
Mara, try going full screen and then sharing the full screen.
Okay. That is a good idea.
It looks like we might have lost Mara.
Are you there, Mara? She froze.
Michael, while we're waiting for her to return, I can offer a few comments to Trey and Audrey, if that's helpful.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do that? Enrijeta, you don't have a copy of the presentation. You're not ready to go, I would imagine.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Chris, yeah, why don't you, so we'll go out of order a little bit. Chris, if you want to give some comments on Trey and Audrey's paper, that'd be great.
Okay, trying to give the ones that are specific to this paper, and then I have a few that bridge across the two. And Trey and Audrey, this wasn't emphasized in the presentation, but I thought a really key point and something that we need to get a better handle on is the large portion of invalid ballots from people who chose to cast a ballot in person after requesting a mail ballot, and differentiating that from rejections by local election officials. This is related to the other paper we're here about, which draws other distinctions between rejections for that happen before election day, and then those that are simply appear to be rejections because the ballots are late. But understanding who those people are and why they showed up. So one of the things that I think would be interesting to look at for future of this research is when ballots were requested and how that's related to them either being not returned, rejected, or these people showing up in person. So anecdotally, the media was covering some counties, stories about counties falling well behind in getting those ballots out. And that is something that we're likely to see more of in this pandemic context or in any context where the rate grows. So trying to get a little better handle on that piece, especially because the state mailing went out so far in advance. So we have a huge tranche of ballots that came in there, but then we have ballots that where people tuned into the election, perhaps, advertising and so forth. And those may be different voters depending on when they requested the ballots. So sort of curious to see that unpacked, along with sort of a more general question about if we can get any insight into these people who are requesting a mail ballot and then showing up in person. It's indicative of something. And it's concerning about voter participation, and it'll probably drive election administrators bonkers. So understanding this as vote by mail grows, who are these people who sort of take one step forward and then jump back towards in-person voting? Are they people who were non-voters previously? Are they new voters? Or are they people who had a preference for in-person voting? Maybe were worried about the pandemic and then changed their mind. Sort of understanding that would be, I think, a very interesting place to dig in further. Another question as we look over time at this, one of the things that is certainly not unique, but an important feature of Georgia election administration is that you can only request a ballot for one election at a time. And I have some question about whether people who requested ballots were thinking they were requesting it for the general election because they were unaware of the primary, right? The number of people who participated who had not been primary voters suggests that people didn't they weren't requesting it because they were interested in the primary. So how many of those folks, didn't get to vote between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or between the Democrat and the Republican in some of the other offices, and therefore weren't interested? But are these people going to be requesting ballots again for the August runoff, again for the general election? Are they going to expect that they have requested a ballot for those downstream elections? That'll be hard to get a handle on, because the complaints will be anecdotal, but this seems to be a place of confusion compared to other states like your neighbor to the south in Florida, right? There, the default is you get a ballot for the next 2 general election cycles for every election and every local election that comes along. And that difference in what people's expectations of it are, I think could be really quite interesting. I'll turn it over to Mark, because I have a few things that bridge the 2 papers that I would like to talk about them together. But one thing that really struck me about your analysis at the end of the paper and the presentation about how the relationship to deaths in the county seems to be stronger than the cases. And you modeled that using OLS. And I was sort of wondering if there is a nonlinear piece to that, right? If there's some sort of threshold to it. And maybe we don't see it in this data, but I think it's an interesting question to ponder as we think about the kind of questions you're asking going forward, as whether this flattens out at some point, like as deaths in the immediate area arise, or how much the sort of national or state saturation of things means that that relationship to local isn't there because people's information isn't so local anymore. I don't really have an answer to that, but it was something that I was sort of puzzling over of like, how much of this local relationship would we expect? At what point does a place reach a threshold where everyone has sort of maxed out their concern? And at what point over time does our information flow from either the state or national level kind of wipe out any of that, that local effects? So I'll stop there. I have a few more things related to both papers, but I think Mara's back. So hopefully she can present, and then I'll talk about both papers.
All right, thanks very much, Chris.
All right, one more time. It was indeed like an internet outage the minute I was going to start presenting. So
Yeah, it's thundering here too, as Mike McDonald
yeah,
said.
we've got some weather going on. So let me try this one more time because it did work in the before we actually started. Let's see here. Also in a different room. So you should be able to see that.
Yes, we do.
Okay. And let's just do a full screen. And can you see that?
Black.
Oh my gosh, it's the same thing. All right. That's what I get for, let's see. Let me try this. Read mode. Yep, that'll work.
There you go, you're good.
Cool, yay. All right. My sincere apologies, friends. Did not anticipate that my internet would go out. I've moved to a different location in the house, so hopefully things will be a little bit more smooth. So yeah, if anything happens during this, Enrijeta will text me if I suddenly go away, and we'll hopefully not have that happen again. So this is really great to be able to share this research following that following the first paper. I found myself wondering as the Georgia primaries were going on, sort of what some of the data would look like, and I would be fascinating to also look at some of the rejection data. So perhaps that is a project in our near future here. So the motivation for this paper fits very neatly into the panel that we have today. We're really interested in understanding what things might look like in the coming upcoming general elections. As we've just seen, voting by mail is on the rise. The use of voting by mail is on the rise. And I think it'll be really important for us to look at rejection data for some of these primary elections that have happened over the spring. But our big concern with vote by mail is the fact that voter eligibility is confirmed remotely. And so there's not sort of this immediate process for addressing eligibility issues like there is at polling places. Not that that is a perfect system by any means, but you know, there can be issues with voters who have a ballot rejected, they're not notified in time. So this is something that is especially concerning in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. We also know there's been some great research done by my co-authors, you know, that have documented variation in standards for verifying ballots. We see these kinds of differences in other states in the country as well. And of course, Georgia is a state that really since 2018 has become come under pretty close scrutiny. So that's our major motivation for this paper. And it's been really great to have Enrijeta and Dan working alongside me in bringing their methodological expertise and insight into this project. So the questions that we're looking at here, we really wanted to try to think through the practical challenges associated with casting and counting absentee ballots as we developed our theoretical expectations for, you know, whether there are certain groups of voters that are more likely to cast a ballot that gets rejected. So I'm going to walk us through what the process of casting and verifying a ballot looks like in Georgia, alongside some of our other theoretical background and justifications to really get a sense of what we were thinking about here. Our basic theoretical argument, the items that we were testing, is that young voters and first-time registrants, you know, are going to be more likely to have cast a ballot that is rejected either because it was returned late or ballot rejected turned in on time but rejected for making mistakes. And we developed a couple of different individual level explanations for these expectations. And we also expect that racial and ethnic minorities will be more likely to face a ballot rejection, but we think it's more likely that there are systemic jurisdiction level explanations happening here. So we find that overall, young voters, racial and ethnic minorities, and first-time registrants, as well as women, this was a group that wasn't in our initial group of hypotheses, but we do have some after-the-fact possible explanations for that finding, but sort of we do confirm the expectations that we develop. So in terms of individual level explanations, we think that it's possible that young voters and first-time registrants in the state, you know, these are folks that they have less experience with the voting process. They might be more prone to making mistakes, you know, might be more prone to cast a ballot that is rejected for these mistakes. You know, thinking about young voters in particular, Georgia is a state where signatures are used to verify a voter's identity and eligibility. These are folks that may not have established signatures. You know, there's this, I guess, kind of a running joke about millennials not being familiar with the U.S. Postal Service. But, you know, it's a real possibility that there are questions about, you know, where do I get stamps and where do I return my ballot? It's really encouraging to hear about what Georgia is doing in terms of providing locations for ballot drop-offs. I think that's a really sort of practical improvement that addresses some of these concerns. So when we're thinking about expectations for why racial and ethnic minority voters might be more likely to cast a ballot that gets rejected, it's sort of more difficult to develop individual level explanations. And so we're drawing on the ample research that's been done that looks at and shows systemic bias against racial and ethnic minority voters in various aspects of elections, at polling places, polling place lines, the provision of services by local election officials, and requests for voter IDs. And there are, of course, other studies that have looked at rejection rates amongst racial and ethnic minorities in other jurisdictions as well. The other possible explanation we're working through is potential disparities in voter education. You know, we did note that the Georgia State Election Board does sort of have this duty to, quote, formulate and conduct voter education programs, but it's likely that there's a lot of variation across county in terms of what those programs look like. So there's some possible disparities as well. And then we also spent a lot of time thinking about sort of this question of implicit bias, and if implicit bias is at play, sort of at what part of the process is that happening? At what point is the individual who's examining the ballot sort of experiencing those implicit bias processes? So to really work through this, we wanted to get a sense of what the process actually looks like in Georgia for casting an absentee ballot. There's a number of pieces of information that are needed. Of course, the name of the elector, their address, the month. It used to be the month and day of birth. I believe in 2018 they changed it to the month and year of birth, but there was major discrepancies as we heard about in 2018 in terms of which forms counties were using. So there's some differences there as well. And then there's the signature that's provided. And so when a ballot is being evaluated, there's the comparison of this identifying information with the voter registration file, the signature comparison, the question of, you know, simply was the ballot on time or was it not on time? And then we did want to make sure that we noted the part of the Georgia Elections Code relating to the notification of rejection. So the code reads specifically, the Board of Registrars or absentee ballot clerk shall promptly notify the elector of such a rejection. So not really a clear definition of what promptly notify means. But we do want to note that there is in the state election code a statute for the ballot curing process. So looking at the ballot evaluation standards, you know, we can think maybe implicit bias is happening through, you know, the identification of putatively racial or ethnic names, you know, implicit bias looking at the age of the voter who is casting the ballot. So the data we have don't allow us to directly test for these theoretical expectations and mechanisms, but we really wanted to make sure we were thinking through all of the different possibilities for what might explain these differences as we are testing these data. So our hypotheses. We expect that racial and ethnic minority voters are going to be more likely to have both ballots that are returned on time, as well as cast late ballots, have these ballots rejected. We expect the same thing for younger voters, as well as for first-time registrants, for a combination of those systemic and individual level reasons that we've been exploring. So the study design, our data comes from the Georgia voter file, as well as absentee information on individuals who cast absentee ballots during the 2018 midterm elections. And then we also have some control data from the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I want to give a huge shout out to Enrijeta, who spent a lot of time cleaning these data, and I know it was a very painful process. So she really did a great job with this. Our unit of analysis is an individual level unit of analysis. We're looking at individual absentee ballots cast by Georgia voters during the 2018 midterm election. So to run our analysis, we use a Heckman two-stage selection model, which I'm going to just offer a little bit more information on in just a couple of slides. And our dependent variable is simply absentee ballot rejection, dummy, 1 if it was rejected, 0 if it was accepted. And then we run 3 different kinds of models. We look at rejections only for ballots that were returned on time, rejections for ballots that were returned late, and then combine both types of rejections. And then in our models, we also include a range of independent variables. Our key ones obviously are race dummy variables for individual race and ethnicity. We parse out age by categorical age groups, and then we also have a variable for registration year, specifically whether or not a voter was newly registered in the state in 2018. And then we have a range of control variables as well as county fixed effects. So just to give some descriptives before I launch into what the models actually look like. This is a map that Enrijeta put together, the vote by mail rejection rate by county across the state. It's pretty straightforward. As you can see, there's a lot of variation in rejection rates across county. So of course, this doesn't tell us anything about the substantive questions of interest here, but it is sort of important to lay out that there is this variation across county, which may hint at different standards for evaluating ballots across counties. So what we're looking at here is the comparison of the ballot rejection rate for white voters relative to Black voters across county, as well as the rejection rate for white voters relative to Hispanic voters across county. And sort of you can see that the rejection rate for both Black and Hispanic voters across counties is above that 45-degree line, really suggesting that there are higher rates of rejection for these groups in these counties. And so then we also wanted to sort of break this down, vote by mail ballot rejection rates within race. And what we see here is that as the percentage of absentee ballots cast by Black voters in a given county goes up, so does the number of rejected ballot, or the percentage of rejected ballots. And for white voters, the pattern is different. As the percentage of ballots cast by white voters goes up, the percentage of rejected ballots goes down. We didn't find a relationship for Hispanic voters, but did want to sort of make sure that we showed these comparisons. So we're also, of course, interested in understanding rejection rates and probabilities by age group and registration group. And so what we have pictured here are the rejection rates for different age groups. You can sort of see here that the probability of rejection for the oldest age group is sort of far less and less spread out than the rejection rates for the youngest age groups, 18 to 22. And then what we have over here on the right-hand side of the panel, these are rejection rates for individuals registered in 2018. So this is our new registration measure. And then individuals registered prior to 2018. So the identification strategy that we use, the Heckman selection model, allows us to account for the fact that there it's not, when folks choose to vote by mail, it's not random. They're not randomly choosing to do so. We wanted to account for the fact that people who vote by mail might be different from voters across the state of Georgia. So the first selection equation determines whether a registrant is choosing to vote by mail or not. And then the outcome equation is the rejection equation. That's really the substantive equation of interest for us. So to show our findings here, I'm realizing that this might not be the best venue to have a full regression model here, but we largely confirm both for received ballots that were received on time but rejected, ballots that were received late, and then combining these measures, we largely confirm our expectations across all racial and ethnic groups. These voters are more likely to have cast a rejected ballot. Not significant for new registrants for ballots that were received on time, but new registrants were more likely to cast a ballot that was received late. And we see that older age groups are much less likely to cast a ballot that is ultimately rejected than younger age groups as well. The one interesting finding that was not in our expectations was this finding pertaining to females. And sort of it's possible that maybe there are name change issues or bureaucratic administrative upkeep issues in terms of matching name changes with newly married women. So it's sort of unclear. That wasn't an expectation we had going in, but we did want to make sure that we noted it. So summary of our overall findings, young and minority first-time registrants and female registrants all have higher rates of ballot rejection, both for on-time as well as casting late ballots. So again, there's no sort of prior expectations we had about female ballot rejections. This name change after marriage might be a possibility. So lingering questions, of course, it's really interesting to see these relationships, but lingering questions are, of course, like, well, what actually explains these discrepancies? And so it might be that we have to dig further into local election official characteristics such as race, age, and partisanship. And we would love sort of ideas about how to parse out these mechanisms in future work. And of course, though, we also want to highlight the practical considerations. We really feel that, especially with an increase in vote by mail, voter education is becoming really, really important this election year, and want to again refer to the Georgia Election Code that does have this mandate for voter education in some form or another pertaining to absentee voting. And then, of course, there's the issue of ballot curing. Of course, voters might make mistakes on their absentee ballots, and we hope that there are ample opportunities for them to cure their ballots in the upcoming general election. And so hopefully we can not see similar rates of rejection in the coming November election. So if everyone's still there, I'm still here. That's all I've got, and I'm looking forward to hearing Chris's comments, and Enrijeta is also on hand to help answer questions. But yeah, thank you for your attention and for your patience.
Great. Thank you, Mara. Chris gave his comments earlier on Trey and Audrey's paper, so I'll let him give his comments now on the paper that Mara just presented and comments that are addressed to both papers.
All right, thank you. And I tried to do my best on the fly there with Trey and Audrey's paper. I have a couple things that I want to add that are specific, that are more about that paper. Then I'll say a few things about Mara, Enrijeta, and Dan's paper, and then a few things that bridge the two. One thing, just in thinking about the framing of the paper, a piece of the literature, Audrey and Trey, that I was thinking about was Adam Berinsky's classic piece talking about the retention of voters from convenience voting. And it struck me that that is at least a way to interpret the higher turnout in the primary, that all these voters were showing up when the Secretary of State sent out the applications and made it that much easier in this low salience election that they show up. And that's consistent with Berinsky's story that we don't see increases in turnout from convenience voting consistently. There are people on the call who will throw eggs at me for characterizing it that way, but right, we see small or no effect from that in high salience election, but we see very consistent increases in participation in primaries, municipal elections, other low salience things. And so one contribution is we haven't seen this studied with this idea of sending out applications. We've seen it in the context of changing the system entirely to allow no excuse to have entirely mail ballot elections, but not this kind of interim intermediate administrative step that I think is important. Let me give a few pieces of feedback to Enrijeta, Mara, and Dan. One of the primary things I think in that I would like to see in the paper as it stands right now is more discussion of or more clarity about the voter-centered problems versus what I think of as the administrative-centered problems. Those may not be the right term, right? But late ballots and failure to return the ballots has a much larger voter behavior component, whereas the rejection of ballots that are returned, right, that's different. And even if you see the problems among the same folks, the cures, the policy or administrative steps that you might take to address those are quite different. Right, one suggests better training, better monitoring of election officials so they're not discriminating. Another is about making sure that information is communicated to voters who are less familiar. I mean, that's in very broad brush terms, right? There's a lot more subtlety to it, but I think that the paper would be clearer about what's going on to talk about those two things, the distinction between those two things, right? It's interesting to see the overall, you run the models with those two separately. But I think that would be really interesting. You talked about replicating this for the Georgia primary or other states, right? That would be super interesting in particular, because I think one of the questions here is what happens if there is discrimination in some of this when the system is flooded, right? And Audrey and Trey's paper seems to indicate that the Georgia system was at flood tide, hopefully a 100-year flood, if not a 500-year flood, at least in terms of the cause. But if we see a lot more people who are unfamiliar with mail ballots, right? People who are maybe consistent voters, but they're consistent in-person voters, they're new to it, the demographics will change, and some of the demographic problems could go away, just because if the problem is unfamiliarity, then we're gonna see it more broadly, because we're just seeing more people who are unfamiliar regardless of what their underlying traits are. When I think about the administrative side, like it could get worse if election officials who are engaging in this are more likely to rely on heuristics like name characteristics, consciously or unconsciously. It could get a lot worse, because they're gonna, as they're dealing with more and they fall back on heuristics, that could get worse. We could also see it get better because they improve their skills, or they prioritize speed and that, or simply a Hawthorne effect in this context where mail ballots are getting a lot more scrutiny and people know that. When they're 5 to 10% of ballots, it's not getting a lot of attention, so the temptation to engage in shenanigans might be higher, but that'll go away with more scrutiny. And maybe just a change. I mean, I've talked to a lot of election officials about how they deal with mail ballots when it's relatively low, and it's treated as a sort of extraordinary method of voting and not an ordinary method of voting, and that it deserves extraordinary standards. Extraordinary is probably the wrong word, non-ordinary. But that piece is interesting, as well as the really big question of, right, in my own research, talking about how problems get better or worse when you have more or less mail ballots, right? I speculated that there's learning by both election officials and voters. Election officials are taking a crash course, but maybe they get better from 2018 to 2020, knowing that this is what they have to deal with. There's a lot of talk. Our good friends Charles and Nate are working hard to connect, mail ballot places to non-mail ballot places to help them learn. But on the voter side, there's a lot more attention in the news media. There's a lot more campaign and civic activity to teach. A thing that I thought was missing from both papers is thinking about the role of political and civic groups encouraging people to return mail ballots. So in the Shino, Suttman-Lea, and Smith paper, the 2018 election, there was promotion because of the controversy about the paper trail. So there was a lot of promotion on the left that might explain why you have more unfamiliar voters who are young, who are people of color, even women, right? That was, not to put too fine a point on it, right? That was Stacey Abrams' coalition. And she was a loud voice about that, as were her allies. So, you know, if you look back even at 2016, do you see the same pattern without that level of mobilization that was going into the Abrams coalition, right? Or does it go away because now the selection effect, the people who are showing up are different? Thinking about, and honestly, I think it's less of a problem in Trey and Audrey's paper, right? But there was a lot of activity in Georgia, not particularly because anybody cared necessarily about that primary, although I'm sure the campaigns were doing some of it. But I know because I was involved with some civic groups that saw Georgia as a testing ground. How do we get people to sign up for mail ballots? How do we get people to return it? I was doing those on the left. I know there were, at least anecdotally, that they were going on the right because people sent me materials from them, right? So there's some political agency shaping the electorate, and we're likely to see that. And thinking about what the implication of that is, especially given the national partisan dynamic of the Republican Party not being in favor of mail ballots and the Democrats being in favor, and what that means as we try to fit this through the system. Okay, I will wrap up with one final point that's taking a step back into the bigger picture, and the monkey cage post that was about this as part of the large, about the Shino, Suttman-Lea, and Smith paper, and the larger conversation about what's going on with mail ballots and election administration more broadly. I think the analysis is good. The critiques about and concerns about mail ballots are there, but I have a bone to pick with the lack of context of compared to what, right? And some of it's a little unfair because, like, I'll point to the Brennan Center analysis that came out the other day about Milwaukee, right? We're talking about losing large numbers of mail ballots, but that's dwarfed compared to the 1/3 decrease in turnout that the Brennan Center analysis finds due to polling place consolidation. That analysis is not perfect. I don't necessarily believe it, but it certainly suggests that polling place consolidation in the face of the pandemic is having those kinds of effects. And that probably is true in Metro Atlanta and Philly and you know, in Kentucky as well, where we saw a huge shrinkage. But I think it's important as a community, as we talk about these impacts, that we be careful not to talk about methods of voting in isolation, and that we talk about, you know, we have to make choices, and we're often making least bad choices, right? Vote by mail is far from perfect, and it has problems, and we should try to solve those problems. But so do other methods. And when we're talking about choices like discrimination, we know from other research, right? We get to polling place consolidation and the citing of those kinds of things. That has its own implications, right? There was some legal cases and a lot of kerfuffle about this, like in Kentucky, starting to talk about it, you know, in some of the next round of elections in July and August, that intentionally or unintentionally can have some of those same discriminatory impacts, not just reducing turnout, but disproportionately reducing turnout. And so I think as we think about these papers, right, Georgia on my mind, mail ballots on my mind, but we need to keep the other pieces involved, and the lines in Georgia, the problems in Metro Georgia with in-person voting, right? Those are real. They were real in California with voting machine problems too, where they had new voting machines, but also consolidating polling places and all kinds of other things, right? These are not red or blue or state specific or south or west or north problems. They're everywhere problems. We need to have this conversation in a larger context. So with that, I'll turn it over. Michael, you're moderating the Q&A. Michael, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to give the panelists a chance to respond to Chris's comments first. So Trey or Audrey on your paper.
Okay, thank you, Chris, very much for your comments. And again, we had very little time to work on this, so we're going to continue to work on it as we get more firm data in on things and continue to monitor things. This really wasn't the focus of the paper, but at least from what I've been able to piece together in terms of the problems on election day, not so much with the equipment per se, but with a lack of seasoned and trained poll workers, especially in some of these Atlanta area counties. So not only did you have people that didn't understand the Georgia election environment in general, but we're also implementing a new system on top of that. So it's sort of like an interactive term in terms of trouble. So that's, I observed on election day out in the Athens area, and so did Audrey, and we observed almost no problems with the new system. But the people in the precincts where we were at had been working in those precincts as election workers for forever. I mean, they're the same people every election. So, so that's maybe a little background on something not related directly to the paper that has to do with the aftermath, I guess you could say, of the primary in Georgia. So, Audrey?
I would just add that one of the most interesting things that not only you had mentioned, but some of the questions had mentioned, really regarded people's attitudes. It's such an interesting area to explore because we have this high level of sort of partisan politicization. And I actually spoke with a lot of the people who are coming in to vote. There were a number who had not participated before, but they wanted to participate for some reason. And many of those who wanted to participate were not even aware of what was on the ballot. It was more, we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's an election going on, I want my voice to be heard. It was almost like I want to be civically engaged because I need to do something to express, my feelings. I observed and had mentioned that there were people who had questions about whether their vote would be counted. And so they would come in and, some said they had not received a ballot, some said they received it, but they didn't want to pay postage on it. There was a large number of reasons that people would give for either not returning their absentee ballot and showing up at the ballot box. But then there were quite a few people that I spoke to that had used it, found it to be very practical, and were very grateful for that opportunity. And I think there are so many factors that have come into play, and it will be interesting to try and unravel some of those. I'd also mention that, from our perspective, I didn't see as much civic engagement in terms of getting people to return their absentee ballots. A lot of it was, very Facebook oriented. I mean, and maybe that was the nature of, COVID-19. You couldn't be out at a rally or a group. You didn't have all those avenues where you could do that face-to-face contact. So a lot of it was virtual. And some people are used to utilizing those and other people were not. There was a lot of that on Facebook, but, and a lot of it among young people on Instagram. So anyway, there's so much for us to do, and we have a whole cadre of students we hope that will be observing and collecting data in November.
Okay, thanks, Audrey. So Mara or Enrijeta, I see Dan's gone. So.
I think Enrijeta had to step out because of fire alarm during Chris's comments. So I will take this as well. So yeah, Chris, thank you so much for your comments. I think your point about getting more clarity about voter-centered problems and sort of like what's going on at the level of the individual voter will be important for us to think through as well. It sounds like, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're interested in us thinking through a little bit more carefully sort of rejection for being late versus rejection on time because of mistake. Like there are some important theoretical things I think that we haven't thought through. Is that my understanding of your initial comment?
Yeah, these are, one is almost entirely the election official, and the other is sort of election official and voter interacting, right? One is mostly behavioral, one is mostly administrative. And the implications, right, in terms of, if you're thinking about writing it from a public administration point of view, the steps you would take in response to that are different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth differentiating those things. Also, because outside actors, third-party groups, whether that's campaigns or civic groups or the news media, can help solve one problem, the behavior one, or make one worse. Foreshadowing my paper from later today. But right, the other one is almost entirely a policy and administration implementation kind of question. And so, they're of interest to different scholars. They have different policy solutions, et cetera. So that's why I think you make a bigger contribution by really drawing the distinction between those two and talking about the magnitude of them, right? The behavioral piece roughly has twice as big an effect in almost every group that you highlighted as a problem as the administrative piece, which is not to diminish the administrative piece. That's real. But even if you solve that, you don't solve the problem, right? So those people who are want to go to the legislature and change the law or go to court and change the practice will only get a third of the solution if they don't solve the behavioral piece too. And I think that message needs to be loud and clear to all the potential people involved in the discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent point. And you had mentioned the role of political and civic groups as well, thinking about that. I think that Bob Stein had a question about whether or not we have measures or a way to capture that. At this point, no. There might be, I don't know what Georgia's campaign finance data looks like. There might be some type of campaign finance data we could draw on, so we are open to suggestions there. And yeah, I think I really appreciate the last point you made, Chris, about taking into consideration the context in which we're writing this paper and sort of the context of vote by mail relative to all of these other challenges that we're seeing in polling places across the country. I think it's just a good note of caution for all of us who are having these conversations and doing this work. So point well taken.
Okay, just to remind the audience, if you have questions for either of the authors of either of the papers, please post them on the Q&A. I'm going to read a couple of them. I think this first one is from Michelle Cantor-Cohen, and I believe this is addressed to Trey and Audrey. So Michelle is asking about, does that account for people who requested ballots not getting them as opposed to changing their mind? So I think she's asking, are you able to distinguish people who didn't get ballots and therefore didn't vote from people who requested ballots and decided not to vote and changed their mind, if I'm reading Michelle's question correctly?
Not really. That's all a little fuzzy. This is very anecdotal. When I was observing, there were a lot of people that walked in with their absentee ballot to turn it in so they could vote on election day. So that would definitely be someone that got their ballot. We know a lot of people didn't get their ballot. We know a lot of people probably got a ballot and just never returned it. So we're going to try to decompose that a little bit further, but it's not easy.
Question for Enrijeta, Mara, and Dan from John Curiel. So following some of the geocoding work by Brian Amos and Mike McDonald, would it be possible to run a robustness check with spatial correlated errors for each individual? That might get at some of the stories of Postal Service failures and such for delivery points.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's an excellent point. I think we definitely have to take a look at that. So thank you. I also saw Lisa's question.
Yeah, I was going to come to that one right now. So Lisa asked, is there variation in how counties are inspecting ballots or doing their signature matches? Do any of the Georgia counties use software to do signature matching or matching the ballot envelope information while others are inspecting them by hand? Are there differences in rejection rates? One might expect software to be different than doing it by hand.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We do not have that information at this point. Maybe if we do a little bit more digging into their websites, we can get something. And yeah, that's a great point, Lisa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Lisa. It's you know, it's really challenging to get sort of across all counties a sense of what their counting process looks like. Right now, we are in the process for other work of going through county websites, making note of what information they have on their websites about absentee voting, making note of any social media presence they have to sort of capture some of the official, you know, voter education efforts that might be going on. So we're working at parsing through some of the mechanisms that Chris brought up. And then, you know, the question about how ballots are verified. I would assume there's immense variation from county to county. We have the Fulton County and the Gwinnett County example from 2018, but it might require a bit more detective style investigation to really get a sense of what the procedures are from county to county. So that'll probably be a little bit of a lengthier process that will take us some time to parse through.
I'm just going to chime in here for a second. There is a status reason on ballots that are rejected or requested or rejected. We've processed all 5,300 because they're an open-ended response, and counties do not use consistent coding for their ballot rejection reasons. But we have coded them. We've classified them by signature, and it's possible to take a look at that for any of the elections. Actually, a lot of the ballot rejections, the ones I've inspected, are less about signature mismatching and more about just a missing signature. And but anyways, we'll be able to get to these sorts of questions, and I've been talking to Dan about it, so I know that we were doing this separately to do all this classification. So I'm sure we're going to incorporate that into the work that you guys have been doing.
Yeah, and Enrijeta, I think that when we had first started this project, we did look at some of those open-ended responses from the administrative data, and it, as Michael was just sort of laying out, it seems like it's quite a process in terms of coding and working through all of that. Would be really interesting. Would be really interesting to see that.
Yeah, we did start with that actually, but also the way how they record the reasons why there is so much variation across counties. So, but that is, that's why we put that in the back burner for now. But I guess that's a good point that we should go and reevaluate. Thank you, Mike.
So Tiffany Davenport asked Mara, Enrijeta, and Dan, does the percent of county non-white population moderate the relationship between race and rejection? Or more broadly, you may think of other contextual variables at the county level. But
yeah, thank you, Tiffany. I think in the graphs that Mara showed, we tried to kind of plot as the percentage of the absentee ballots cast by Blacks is going up, what happens to the rejection rate. And kind of our thought process there was that in counties with a higher percentage of non-white voters, those are the counties that are going to have a higher percentage of ballots cast by non-whites. And so I think we see that actually that is the case, because that if you see the regression line goes upward. So there is a positive correlation there.
I actually had a comment for Trey and Audrey. You're looking at the how much it changes the way in which people vote. I keep going back to Verva, Schlossman, and Brady's explanation of why people either do or don't vote, right? So they said people don't vote because they couldn't, it was difficult, they didn't want to, they didn't really care about the election, or nobody asked them. And one of the things about what happened in the case that you're talking about this year in Georgia in the primary is somebody asked them. The Secretary of State sent out a piece of mail to, I guess, all registrants in Georgia, right? And said, you know, you have the opportunity to vote by mail. And so while we often think of this as sort of a convenience voting, it's a shift in the mode of voting that you're focused on. It's also an act of mobilization, right? So you could think of that in kind of the Gerber Green sense of this is a state official mobilizing the people of Georgia to vote in this election. And I think that raises some questions about, and I think Chris alluded to some of these in his comments. It raises questions about what might happen in the general election, what might happen 2 years from now and the next set of elections, as to whether those people will not just retain the mode of voting, but whether they're more likely to vote because they voted this time in the future elections because of some habit formation.
Yes, thank you. I agree. Everyone essentially, if you were an active registrant, 6.9 million active registrants all got the same treatment effect. So in this case.
Right. It'd be nice if you could find some accidental control group that you can get the treatment effect or something.
Well, they're inactive registrants, but those people are inactive for a reason usually. Right. So they haven't been participating.
They're not randomly assigned for sure.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, let me just check and see if there are other questions that haven't been answered. There are some questions that y'all answered that before. David Kimball previously said it might be worth examining variations in absentee return rates across the counties. I don't know if you've got any other response on that. And John Curiel originally asked, would it be possible to get any COVID results for units smaller than counties, given the somewhat arbitrary nature of political boundaries where there correlated spatial errors and the independent variables added as covariates? I think Audrey said most of the public data were at the county level.
It is. Oh, go ahead, Trey.
Go ahead, Audrey.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, most of the stuff that we're getting that is public record is, at the county level or by region, where they have amalgamated some of it. But it might be interesting for us to actually try and look at local media when it's available and their rate of stories on COVID-19, because again, as was raised, the perception of the virus versus what's actually going on around you, it's really hard for people to get information in certain areas. So they really don't know how high the levels are. And some of them don't trust the information they're getting. So maybe we could look at, a more specific location and drill down a little bit deeper if we used a local media source.
Yeah, one thought I had about this is I believe Georgia has a number of areas that have media markets that are based outside of the state of Georgia, in which case they'd be more likely to get information about what's happening in those other states, or at least a sort of a different picture that might give you some leverage on kind of how people are responding to that information, right? And if they're hearing about what's happening in, I don't know, Tallahassee, I don't even know if that media market covers, but
Jacksonville is a big one for Southeast Georgia.
Right. Yeah. So if if what they're hearing about is all about Florida and what's happening in Jacksonville, and they're not hearing about Georgia, that could potentially be something where you could get some leverage on the difference in the local media exposure to information about the local conditions.
Well, and to follow up on one other point, you had talked about variation in civic interest groups, getting people to go out there and talking more about teaching them how to get their absentee ballot voting. I went and looked at some sources, and it'd be interesting to see. I found quite a few Democratic county party organizations putting out some information about how to cast their absentee ballot that was out there. And I wonder if we might see some differences between the two parties and how active they were in this session to promote that. My sense is that we might see more on the Democratic side than on the Republican side for this one.
Okay, I think we've talked about all of the, I'm sorry, David Kimball. David just asked, the second paper finds evidence of selection bias. What does this mean about absentee voting and the rejection process?
That's another good question. So I don't think that model is telling us much about absentee and rejection rates, but what it actually does is to help us reduce the bias in our estimates for who votes absentee and rejection rates. So mostly for the rejection rates. So, but that's what I can say on that.
Okay, I think we've covered the questions, and a couple of people left comments in the question and answers that Virginia Gray mentioned. Chris made comments on the first paper asking why people would request a ballot and then show up in person voting. I'll relay Virginia's personal experience, if that's okay with her. That from my personal experience in North Carolina, early March primary, I was going to be out of the country for the primary, so I requested absentee ballot, which was never mailed to me. So then I had to hustle down to vote on the last day of early voting, right before I left the country. So it could be delays in postal service or other kinds of things, and then people are responding to that if they don't see if the mechanics of one system don't work right, they may use another system as a backup. So.
Yeah, well, this goes back to the point I was making earlier. I think it's really interesting to look at the timing of the requests, particularly, people who surge in the time after the state mailing. And I haven't looked at the data all that closely, but my sense is there's a pretty sizable spike after that mailing hits that then flattens out. And then we see the normal rise in request rates as we get closer to the election and people are thinking about it. But if election officials were overwhelmed with all that was going on, not just the mail ballots, but all that was going on, and they weren't getting ballots out. So here in New York, we went to mail ballots for the first time for some local elections, and the printer who prints half the mail ballots in this state ran out of envelopes. So people were getting their mail ballots. They were being mailed to every voter for the presidential primary, and they were coming 3 days, 4 days in advance of being returned. So the governor issued an executive order changing us from a received by to a postmark deadline, and more than half the ballots came in after that. But anecdotally, right, lots of people said, I got my ballots 3 days beforehand. By the time I filled it out, I knew it wasn't going to get back to the county elections office in time. So I just didn't bother because it was the primary, right? And how much of that is that big gap of not voting? If that's the case, then that's a canary in the coal mine for November, when that problem is going to be much worse and inform an important administrative debate. There are states that are already moving back the deadline for when you have to request a mail ballot, which means, they can tell voters, but they still have to deal with all those incoming inquiries. and the workload, and we have to deal with voters who are going to be upset and frustrated that they don't want to go vote in person, and now they're being told they can't because they didn't request their mail ballot 2 or 3 weeks in advance. There's a whole bunch of stuff here that I think we can really inform a lot of this about how many people that is, how real is that problem versus right, squeaky wheels that are going to the media and complaining about it. All of those things I think are important to try to quantify in the analysis.
Okay, so we had a really good attendance for this panel as we did yesterday. So I appreciate all of the panelists and all of the attendees. Good questions that everybody submitted. I think we're just about done. Mike McDonald shared in the chat to everybody a few minutes ago the link for the second panel today, which is about COVID and public opinion about elections. So we're looking forward to another good panel. So I want to thank all the panelists, yay, and thank you for your papers. Chris, thanks for your great comments. And we'll see everybody in a few minutes at the next panel then. So thank you.